The grain elevator's steel door hadn't been opened in 12 years, not since the day Marcus Holloway's father walked out to check on a shipment and never walked back in. The padlock was rusted solid, the chain wrapped around the handles corroded to the point where Marcus needed bolt cutters just to approach what his father had sealed away the morning he died. His 8-year-old daughter Emma stood behind him in the Kansas dawn, her small hand gripping his jacket, both of them looking at the structure that had defined 3 generations of Holloways and that Marcus had inherited along with debt he couldn't pay and land he couldn't sell. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The bolt cutters snapped through the chain with the sound of metal giving way to force, and the chain fell to the concrete with a finality that made Emma step closer to her father. Marcus pulled the door open, its hinges screaming after years of disuse, revealing darkness that his flashlight barely penetrated. The smell that emerged was dust and grain and something else, something metallic and old that made the hair on Marcus's neck stand up. "Why did Grandpa lock it?" Emma asked, her voice small in the morning quiet. "I don't know, sweetheart. But we're about to find out." Marcus had returned to the family farm 6 months ago after his father's lawyer finally tracked him down in Denver, where he'd been working construction and raising Emma alone since her mother had left when she was 2. The inheritance had seemed like salvation at first: land, equipment, a grain elevator that had served local farmers for 60 years. But the lawyer's next words had demolished that hope. The property carried $300,000 in liens and unpaid loans, the equipment was outdated and broken, and the grain elevator had been sealed by his father with explicit instructions that it not be opened until Marcus returned to claim it. "If he comes back, he'll know what to do with what's inside," the lawyer had read from his father's final instructions. "If he doesn't, let the bank take it all. Better gone than misused." Marcus hadn't understood what his father meant, had spent months trying to work the farm with equipment that barely functioned, trying to generate income that could service debt that grew faster than crops. The bank had been patient at first, then increasingly insistent, and finally had issued foreclosure proceedings. Marcus had 30 days to either pay $100,000 toward the principal or lose everything his family had built over 3 generations. The grain elevator was his last option. Whatever his father had sealed inside might have value, might be sold to raise money, might be the difference between keeping the farm and walking away with nothing. Marcus had postponed opening it because his father's instructions had carried weight, had suggested that what was inside required understanding Marcus wasn't sure he possessed. But desperation eventually overwhelmed caution, and now he stood at the threshold of his father's secret with his daughter and a flashlight and the weight of generational legacy pressing down like Kansas heat. They entered carefully, Marcus going first, testing each step before letting Emma follow. The elevator's interior was vast, rising 70 feet to a ceiling lost in shadows, the concrete bins that once held grain now empty except for dust that danced in the flashlight beam. Everything looked abandoned but maintained, as if his father had cleaned it thoroughly before sealing it shut. The main floor revealed nothing unusual: old equipment, empty bins, a small office with paperwork from 2012. But Marcus noticed something that made him stop. The floor in the center of the structure, directly beneath the elevator mechanism, showed where patterns that didn't match the rest. As if something heavy had been moved repeatedly across the same path. He traced the wear marks to a section of floor that looked different, the concrete slightly newer than surrounding areas. Marcus knelt, running his hands along the seam, finding it was actually a hatch sealed with bolts that had been painted over to match the floor. His father had hidden this deliberately, had made it blend so completely that casual inspection would miss it entirely. "Emma, go wait by the door. I need to check something." "But Dad, please, sweetheart. Just for a minute." After Emma reluctantly moved to the entrance, Marcus used a wrench from his truck to remove the bolts, each one requiring significant force to break through paint and rust. When the last bolt came free, he lifted the hatch, revealing a ladder descending into darkness below the elevator's foundation. Marcus climbed down alone, his flashlight illuminating a chamber approximately 20 feet square, built beneath the grain elevator with the same careful construction that characterized everything his father had done. But it wasn't the chamber itself that made Marcus's hands shake, it was what it contained. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, and on those shelves sat hundreds of containers. Glass jars filled with seeds, each one labeled with varieties Marcus had never heard of. Heirloom wheat and corn and soybeans, varieties that had been developed over generations by farmers who'd valued specific characteristics, drought resistance, flavor, pest tolerance, before industrial agriculture had narrowed crop diversity to a handful of commercially viable strains. But it was the far wall that made Marcus understand why his father had sealed this chamber, why he'd left instructions that it not be opened unless Marcus returned. Floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets, and inside them, carefully organized documentation. Seed breeding records going back to the 1920s. Detailed notes about crop performance under different conditions. Maps showing where specific varieties had originated. Letters from farmers across the Midwest sharing seeds and knowledge, building a network of agricultural diversity that had thrived before consolidation had made it obsolete. And beneath all of this, in a fireproof safe that required the combination Marcus had found in his father's papers, were the real treasures. Patents that had never been filed. Genetic sequences for varieties that had never been commercially released. Evidence that his father, and his grandfather before him, had been developing crops with characteristics that modern agribusiness would pay millions to access. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus sat on the chamber floor, surrounded by his family's hidden work, trying to process the implications. His father had been a quiet man, had run the farm efficiently but without particular distinction that Marcus had noticed as a rebellious teenager eager to escape rural life. But this chamber revealed something else entirely, a man who'd been part of a larger movement to preserve agricultural diversity, who'd understood that the seeds and knowledge stored here represented value that transcended immediate profit. He climbed back up the ladder to find Emma exactly where he'd left her, her face worried. "What's down there?" "History. And maybe our future, if I can figure out what to do with it." Over the next 3 days, Marcus documented everything in the chamber, photographing every jar and every file, trying to understand the scope of what his father had preserved. The seed collection alone represented decades of careful cultivation, varieties that had been adapted to specific soil types and climate conditions, genetic diversity that had been lost as commercial agriculture had standardized around a few high-yield strains. But it was the breeding records that revealed the real story. His grandfather had started the collection in the 1930s, trading seeds with other farmers, documenting which varieties performed best under drought conditions or resisted specific pests. His father had continued and expanded the work, had networked with agricultural scientists who shared concern about decreasing crop diversity, had participated in underground efforts to preserve seeds that corporations were letting disappear as they consolidated control over commercial varieties. The patents were the complication. Several of the varieties his father had developed showed characteristics that would be extremely valuable to modern agriculture: drought tolerance, reduced water requirements, natural pest resistance. Filing those patents could generate substantial income through licensing. But the letters in the filing cabinets revealed his father's deep ambivalence about that path. These seeds belonged to farmers, not corporations, he'd written to a colleague in 2010. "If I patent them, I'm doing the same thing I've fought against, privatizing what should be common heritage. But if I don't protect them legally, corporations will take them anyway and lock them behind their own patents. I don't know the right answer." Marcus understood his father's dilemma now, understood why the elevator had been sealed with instructions that suggested the contents required judgment Marcus wasn't sure he possessed. He could sell the patents to agricultural companies, could probably raise enough money to pay off the farm's debts and have substantial funds remaining. But doing so would betray the principles his father and grandfather had worked to uphold. Or he could try to do what his father had done, preserve the seeds and knowledge, share them with farmers who valued diversity over profit, continue the quiet work of maintaining genetic heritage that industrial agriculture was erasing. But that path didn't pay debts or generate the income needed to keep the farm operational. He was still wrestling with this decision when a truck pulled into the farm's driveway, a new pickup that contrasted sharply with Marcus's aging equipment. The man who got out was maybe 50, wearing work clothes that were too clean, his posture suggesting someone used to being heard when he spoke. "Marcus Holloway," the man called as he approached. "That's right. Name's Richard Steele. I represent AgriCorp Solutions, one of the major agricultural biotechnology firms. I understand you recently inherited this property from your father." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, recognizing this was no coincidental visit. "How did you know that?" "Your father and I had been in negotiations before he died. He'd approached us about potentially licensing some seed varieties he'd been developing. We'd reached preliminary agreements, but he passed before anything was finalized." Steele pulled out a folder from his truck. "I'm here to resume those discussions if you're interested." Marcus took the folder, finding it contained offer letters dated from 2012, just months before his father's death. The amounts being proposed were substantial, $500,000 up front for access to 3 specific varieties, with ongoing royalties if they proved commercially viable. Enough money to save the farm and more. But Marcus also noticed something in the correspondence. His father's last letter to AgriCorp, dated 2 weeks before he died, had rejected their offers. After careful consideration, his father had written, "I've decided these varieties should remain in the public domain rather than being controlled by commercial interests. I appreciate your offers but won't be proceeding with licensing agreements." Steele noticed Marcus reading the rejection letter. "Your father was a principled man, maybe too principled for his own good. But you're in a different situation. You've inherited significant debt, you're facing foreclosure, and you've got a daughter to support. Pride is expensive when the bank's calling. How do you know about my financial situation? Small towns talk, and agricultural lenders talk to agricultural companies. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for the varieties your father developed, plus any breeding documentation that would help us commercialize them quickly." Steele named a figure that made Marcus's breath catch, $1 million up front, with guaranteed minimums of $100,000 annually for 10 years. That's a lot of money for seeds. It's a lot of money for solutions to problems that cost farmers billions annually. Your father understood the value of what he'd created, he just couldn't bring himself to profit from it. But you can make a different choice, can honor his work by ensuring it gets used to help farmers rather than sitting in storage while your farm gets foreclosed. After Steele left with a promise to return in 2 days for Marcus's decision, Marcus stood in the farmyard feeling the weight of choices his father had avoided by dying before finalizing them. The money would solve everything, pay off debts, modernize equipment, give Emma stability and opportunities a struggling farm couldn't provide. His father's principles were admirable, but principles didn't keep families housed or fed. That evening, while Emma slept, Marcus returned to the chamber beneath the grain elevator, reading through his father's correspondence with other seed savers and agricultural diversity advocates. The letters revealed a community of people who believed that genetic diversity in crops was essential for long-term food security, that corporate consolidation of seed varieties created dangerous vulnerabilities, that farmers' traditional practice of saving and sharing seeds was worth preserving despite economic pressure toward commercial uniformity. One letter, from a farmer in Iowa, had been written just weeks before his father's death. "Your collection represents more than just seeds," the farmer had written. "It represents generations of knowledge about what works in specific conditions, about how to adapt crops to local environments, about the relationship between farmers and the land they work. If that knowledge disappears into corporate patents, we lose something we won't be able to recover." Marcus found himself thinking about his own relationship with the land, about why he'd left and why he'd returned. He'd fled rural life at 18, had spent 15 years convinced that farming was a dying profession for people too stubborn or too limited to find better opportunities. But returning with Emma, working the land his father and grandfather had worked, he'd started understanding something his younger self had missed, that farming wasn't just commerce, it was stewardship, was connection to something larger than quarterly profits. The seed collection his father had preserved wasn't valuable because the varieties could be patented. It was valuable because it represented alternatives, possibilities, genetic diversity that might prove crucial when climate conditions changed or new pests emerged or commercial varieties failed. His father and grandfather had understood they were maintaining options, keeping alive knowledge that might seem obsolete until circumstances made it essential. But that understanding didn't pay the mortgage. Didn't keep Emma fed and clothed and educated. Didn't prevent foreclosure or generate the income needed to operate a farm that was barely viable even with modern advantages. Marcus was still in the chamber when his phone rang, Richard Steele's number showing on the screen though it was nearly midnight. He answered, curious what required contact at this hour. "Mr. Holloway, I wanted to reach you before you made any irreversible decisions." Steele's voice carried urgency that suggested this wasn't casual conversation. "I've been authorized to increase our offer significantly. $2 million up front, guaranteed annual minimums of $200,000 for 15 years. That's more money than this farm would generate in your lifetime of working it. That's a substantial increase from this afternoon's offer. Because we've done more research on what your father preserved. The drought-tolerant wheat variety alone could be worth tens of millions if it performs as his breeding records suggest. The corn varieties that show natural pest resistance could revolutionize sustainable agriculture. We're prepared to pay premium rates for access to all of it, seeds, documentation, breeding records, everything." Marcus felt something shift in his understanding. "You're not offering to license specific varieties. You want the entire collection. We want to ensure we have access to all the genetic material your father developed, yes. And we want to prevent competitors from acquiring it. This is a comprehensive offer for comprehensive access. What happens to the varieties after you acquire them? They become proprietary to AgriCorp. We'll develop them commercially, patent them where possible, license them to farmers through our existing distribution networks." Steele paused. "Look, I understand your father had idealistic notions about seeds being public heritage. But the reality is that modern agriculture requires investment in research and development that only companies like ours can provide. By selling to us, you're ensuring these varieties get commercialized and used rather than sitting in storage serving nobody." After hanging up, Marcus sat in the chamber thinking about Steele's words and his father's letters, about the choice being presented as binary when maybe it wasn't. He could sell everything to AgriCorp, could take money that would change his and Emma's lives fundamentally. Or he could try to honor his father's principles, could maintain the collection as his father had maintained it, could continue work that seemed increasingly quixotic in an era of corporate agriculture. But maybe there was a third option, something his father hadn't lived long enough to consider or implement. The chamber contained more than just valuable seed varieties, it contained documentation of how those varieties had been developed, contained knowledge about collaborative breeding and farmer-to-farmer sharing, contained evidence of an approach to agriculture that valued diversity and resilience over maximum short-term yield. What if that knowledge could be preserved and shared without being sold to corporations? What if the seeds could be distributed to farmers who'd use them responsibly rather than locked behind patents? What if there was a way to honor both his father's principles and his own need for financial survival? Marcus spent the next 2 days researching seed banks and agricultural heritage organizations, learning about legal structures that could protect genetic material while making it available to farmers, discovering that his father's collection wasn't unique but was part of a larger network of preservation efforts that had operated quietly while commercial agriculture consolidated around standardized varieties. He found organizations that would help establish the collection as a seed library, legal frameworks that could protect it from corporate acquisition while making it accessible to farmers who agreed to maintain open-source principles. The model wouldn't generate millions like AgriCorp's offer, but it might generate enough through grants and educational programs to help keep the farm operational while serving the purpose his father had intended. When Richard Steele returned as scheduled, Marcus met him in the farmyard rather than inviting him inside. Emma watched from the porch, understanding that something important was happening even if she didn't fully grasp the details. "I've made my decision," Marcus said without preamble. Steele smiled, clearly expecting acceptance. "Excellent. I've got contracts ready. I'm not selling to AgriCorp. Not the seeds, not the documentation, not any of it." The smile disappeared. "Mr. Holloway, you need to think carefully about this. The foreclosure deadline is approaching, and you won't find another buyer offering anywhere near what we're prepared to pay. I'm not looking for another buyer. I'm establishing a nonprofit seed library that will maintain the collection and make it available to farmers under open source agreements. The seeds will remain in the public domain like my father wanted." Steele's expression hardened. "That's a romantic idea that won't pay your bills. You'll lose the farm trying to honor principles that made your father die broke." "Maybe. But at least I'll know the work he did, the work my grandfather did, will serve the purpose they intended rather than being locked behind corporate patents." Marcus pulled out the folder Steele had given him 2 days earlier. "Your own correspondence shows my father rejected your offers before he died. I'm honoring that decision. You're making a mistake that will cost you everything. Possibly. But it's my mistake to make." After Steele left, driving away with the kind of controlled anger that suggested this conversation wasn't over, Emma joined Marcus in the yard. "Are we going to lose the farm?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful control of a child trying not to burden adults with fear. "I don't know, sweetheart. But we're going to try to save it the right way, doing what Grandpa would have wanted." Marcus knelt to her level. "Sometimes the easy path and the right path aren't the same. Grandpa chose right over easy, and now I'm choosing the same thing. Even if it means we have to leave? Even then. Because some things matter more than just keeping what's ours." Grandpa understood that, and I'm starting to understand it too. The foreclosure deadline approached while Marcus worked frantically to establish the legal structures that would protect the seed collection. He found allies in agricultural diversity advocates, in university researchers who valued the breeding documentation, in farmers who remembered his father and wanted to support work he'd dedicated his life to. They helped him incorporate as a nonprofit, establish governance structures that prevented commercial acquisition, create frameworks for distributing seeds to farmers who agreed to maintain open-source principles. But establishing legal structures didn't pay immediate debts. The bank was sympathetic but firm. $100,000 was needed within 2 weeks or foreclosure proceedings would commence. Marcus had exhausted every conventional financing option, had learned that banks didn't lend against idealistic notions of agricultural heritage no matter how genuinely valuable. He was reviewing loan rejection letters in his father's office when Emma called from outside, her voice carrying urgency that made Marcus's chest tighten. He ran to find her standing near the grain elevator with a man Marcus recognized from photographs in his father's files, Samuel Ortega, one of the farmers his father had corresponded with for decades about seed preservation. "I heard about what you're trying to do," Samuel said, his weathered face showing both approval and concern. "Heard you rejected AgriCorp's offer to establish a seed library like your father wanted. Word travels fast. Agricultural community is smaller than people think, and people who care about seed diversity are a tight group. Your father was respected among us, was known for his integrity and his commitment to preservation." Samuel paused. "I also heard you're facing foreclosure because you can't raise the money needed to keep the farm." Marcus felt embarrassment mixed with resignation. "That's true. But losing the farm is better than betraying what my father built. Maybe you don't have to choose. I've talked to others in the network, farmers who benefited from your father's work over the years, people who understand that what you're trying to preserve matters. We've pooled resources, not enough to pay off all your debts, but enough to meet the bank's immediate deadline if you're willing to accept help." Samuel handed Marcus a check, and the amount made Marcus's eyes blur. $60,000, raised from farmers across 3 states. People who valued what his father had preserved and wanted to support its continuation. "This isn't charity," Samuel said firmly. "This is investment in something that serves all of us. The seeds your father maintained, the knowledge he documented, that has value that goes beyond any single farm. We're protecting our shared heritage, and that requires supporting people willing to do the difficult work of preservation." Marcus looked at the check, at Emma standing nearby understanding this was important even if she didn't grasp all the details, at the grain elevator that held 3 generations of careful work. $60,000 wasn't enough by itself, but combined with what he'd managed to save and with a smaller loan the Agricultural Heritage Organization had agreed to provide, it would meet the bank's immediate requirement. "I don't know how to thank you," Marcus said, his voice not quite steady. "Keep the collection accessible to farmers who need it. Continue the work your father started. That's thanks enough." Samuel looked at the grain elevator with appreciation that showed he understood what it represented. "Your father spent his life preserving alternatives, maintaining diversity, keeping alive knowledge that commercial agriculture wants to erase. That work matters more now than ever, and we need people willing to carry it forward even when it costs them." The bank accepted Marcus's payment, granting a 6-month extension on remaining debt and acknowledging the nonprofit structure being established around the seed collection. The foreclosure was averted, though the farm's financial situation remained precarious enough that a single bad harvest or unexpected expense could trigger renewed crisis. But Marcus had breathing room, had time to develop sustainable models for maintaining both the farm and the seed library, had support from a community he hadn't known existed until necessity revealed it. The chamber beneath the grain elevator, which his father had sealed expecting it might be discovered only after foreclosure, had become the foundation for something larger than any single farm. Over the following months, as Marcus worked to establish the seed library and manage the farm simultaneously, he began understanding his father's life differently. The quiet man who'd seemed to lack ambition, who'd run a modest operation without particular distinction, had actually been part of a significant movement working to preserve agricultural diversity against enormous commercial pressure. His father's legacy wasn't the struggling farm itself, it was the knowledge and genetic material he'd preserved, was the network of farmers he'd collaborated with, was the principles he'd upheld even when doing so cost him economically. Emma adapted to their new circumstances with the flexibility of children who learn resilience through necessity. She helped in the seed library, learned to catalog varieties and document growing conditions, developed understanding of agricultural heritage that most kids her age would never encounter. Marcus watched his daughter connect to the land and to his family's work, saw her find purpose in preservation that transcended immediate profit. The seed library attracted attention from universities and research institutions, from farmers seeking alternatives to commercial varieties, from advocates working to maintain food security through genetic diversity. The collection his father had preserved, which AgriCorp had valued at $2 million, became accessible to people who used it to develop crops adapted to changing climate conditions, to maintain varieties suited to specific regional characteristics, to preserve knowledge about how farmers had historically managed agricultural challenges. Marcus understood now why his father had sealed the grain elevator with instructions that it not be opened unless he returned. His father had known that the contents required someone who understood both the value of what had been preserved and the principles that had motivated its preservation. Selling to AgriCorp would have been easy and profitable, but it would have betrayed everything 3 generations had worked to maintain. By choosing the harder path, by establishing the seed library and accepting support from the agricultural diversity community, Marcus had honored his father's work while creating something sustainable that could continue serving farmers long after the current generation was gone. The grain elevator that had been sealed for 12 years now served as repository and distribution center, its hidden chamber transformed from secret storage to accessible archive. The farm remained financially precarious, required constant attention and careful management to remain viable. But it was no longer just Marcus struggling alone, it was part of a network, was supported by people who valued what it preserved, was contributing to something larger than its own survival. His father's quiet work had created connections and generated goodwill that proved more valuable than any corporate buyout could have provided. On evenings when Marcus descended into the chamber to catalog seeds or document breeding records, he thought about his father working alone in this space, preserving varieties and knowledge without recognition or appreciation from most of the agricultural world. His father had trusted that eventually someone would understand, would make choices that honored preservation over profit, would continue work that seemed thankless until circumstances revealed its value. That trust had been rewarded, though not in ways his father could have predicted. The sealed grain elevator had become revelation rather than just inheritance, had transformed Marcus's understanding of his family's legacy and his own responsibilities. The seeds his grandfather had collected and his father had preserved were now being planted by farmers across the region, were contributing to agricultural resilience in ways that justified decades of quiet dedication. Marcus understood now that his father hadn't sealed the grain elevator to hide something valuable, he'd sealed it to protect something important, to ensure it would only be opened by someone who'd make responsible choices about its contents. The 12-year seal had been test and trust, had been his father's way of ensuring that generational work would continue only if his son proved worthy of it. By choosing right over easy, by establishing the seed library rather than selling to AgriCorp, by accepting help from the agricultural diversity community rather than pursuing profit alone, Marcus had passed that test. The grain elevator stood no longer sealed but serving, its contents available to farmers who understood their value, its chamber transformed from hidden storage to living archive. The land stretched away in patterns that had been farmed for 3 generations, soil that had yielded crops through drought and flood, through economic boom and agricultural consolidation, through quiet dedication to principles that valued diversity over efficiency. That land would continue being farmed by Holloways, would continue producing not just crops but knowledge, would continue serving purposes that transcended immediate profit. Emma was learning to be a farmer, was understanding that agriculture was more than just planting and harvest, was discovering that stewardship meant preserving alternatives and maintaining diversity and protecting knowledge that commercial interests wanted to control. She asked questions about why certain varieties mattered, about how her great-grandfather had developed specific traits, about what it meant to keep seeds in the public domain when corporations would pay millions for exclusive control. Marcus answered those questions by showing her the letters in the filing cabinets, by explaining how his father and grandfather had worked to preserve options that might prove essential when circumstances changed. He taught her that value wasn't just measured in dollars, that some inheritances came with obligations that extended beyond personal benefit, that legacy was built through choices made when easy and right diverged. 5 years after opening the sealed grain elevator, Marcus stood with Emma in the chamber that had revealed his family's hidden work. The shelves that had held undocumented seeds now held carefully cataloged varieties available to farmers across 3 states. The filing cabinets that had contained secret breeding records now contributed to university research on agricultural diversity. The space his father had sealed in hope and uncertainty now served the community that valued what it preserved. "Grandpa would be proud," Emma said, now 13 and understanding the significance of what her family maintained. "I think so. He did the hard work of preserving all this, trusted that eventually someone would understand why it mattered. I just opened the door and tried to honor what he built. But you chose to keep it available instead of selling it for money we really needed. That was brave." Marcus thought about this, about the choices that had seemed impossibly difficult but that felt inevitable in retrospect. It wasn't brave, it was just right. Sometimes the right choice is obvious even when it's hard, and what makes you who you are is whether you have the courage to follow through. They climbed the ladder back to the grain elevator's main floor, emerging into Kansas sunlight that illuminated equipment that was newer now, operations that were sustainable, a farm that served both commercial agriculture and heritage preservation. The network Samuel Ortega had revealed continued supporting their work, farmers sharing resources and knowledge, creating resilience through collaboration rather than competition. Marcus received occasional calls from AgriCorp representatives, each one offering progressively larger amounts for the seed collection, each one suggesting he was foolish to maintain nonprofit status when commercial licensing could generate substantial income. He declined politely, explaining that some things weren't for sale regardless of price, that his family's work had value that transcended monetary measurement. The farm would never make him wealthy, would always require careful management and community support to remain viable. But it provided living for his family while serving purpose his father and grandfather would have recognized and valued. The grain elevator his father had sealed stood now as working monument to quiet dedication, to principles maintained across generations, to the understanding that agricultural diversity was worth preserving even when commercial interests pushed toward consolidation. Emma talked about studying agricultural science in college, about learning genetic preservation techniques, about continuing work her family had been doing for nearly a century. Marcus listened to his daughter's plans and understood that the legacy his father had preserved was being carried forward not through obligation but through genuine commitment, through understanding that had been earned rather than inherited. On warm evenings, after the day's work was finished and Emma was doing homework, Marcus would sometimes walk to the grain elevator and look at the structure that had defined his family's story. 3 generations had worked this land, had maintained this collection, had upheld principles about agricultural diversity and farmer autonomy and the importance of preserving alternatives. That work continued not because it was profitable but because it mattered, because knowledge and genetic diversity had value that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings. The sealed grain elevator had been his father's final trust, his last test of whether his son would understand what had been preserved and why it deserved protection. By choosing to establish the seed library rather than sell to AgriCorp, by accepting support from the agricultural diversity community, by continuing work that served farmers rather than corporations, Marcus had proven worthy of that trust. The grain elevator stood solid against the Kansas sky, its hidden chamber no longer secret but still sacred, still holding seeds and knowledge that represented generations of careful work. What had been sealed was now serving, what had been hidden was now shared, what had been inheritance had become legacy actively maintained and carried forward. Marcus understood now why his father had locked the grain elevator 12 years before his death, why the instructions had specified it should only be open when Marcus returned. His father had known the contents would present a choice, profit or principles, easy money or harder work that served larger purpose. He trusted that his son would choose right, would understand that some inheritances came with obligations that couldn't be surrendered for any price. That trust had been warranted. The grain elevator his father had sealed stood now as working archive, its contents serving farmers who valued diversity, its chamber transformed from hidden storage to accessible resource. The work 3 generations had done continued not through Marcus alone but through a network of farmers who understood that agricultural heritage was worth preserving, that genetic diversity was essential for long-term food security, that some knowledge was too important to be locked behind corporate patents. The land breathed an evening air that had blown across these fields for centuries, soil that remembered every crop planted and every harvest gathered, ground that had been worked by hands that valued stewardship over extraction. That land would continue being farmed by people who understood its value transcended immediate profit, who knew that legacy was built through choices made when circumstances tested character. Emma joined her father outside, both of them looking at the grain elevator in fading light. "Do you ever regret not taking the money?" she asked. Marcus considered this honestly. "Sometimes I wonder what life would be like with $2 million, with security we'll probably never have running the farm this way. But then I think about Grandpa working alone in that chamber, preserving seeds and documenting knowledge without recognition, trusting that eventually it would matter. I can't regret honoring that work, even when it costs us financially. I'm glad you kept it. I like knowing we're part of something bigger, that the farm does more than just grow crops." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As darkness settled over Kansas farmland that had been worked for 3 generations, the grain elevator stood as monument to choices made when easy and right diverged, to principles maintained across generations, to trust rewarded through decisions that honored heritage over profit. The sealed door had been opened, the hidden chamber revealed, the secret work made accessible to farmers who would use it responsibly. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you owned but what you preserved, not what you inherited but what you chose to protect and pass forward. The grain elevator that had been sealed for 12 years now served the purpose for which 3 generations had worked, its contents available to people who understood their value, its existence proof that some knowledge was too important to be sold regardless of price. Marcus locked the grain elevator for the night, its door now secured with simple padlock rather than sealed chain, its contents documented and accessible rather than hidden and forgotten. The structure his father had sealed stood now as working testament to quiet courage, to principles upheld when commercial pressure demanded surrender, to the understanding that agricultural diversity was worth defending even when defending it cost you everything you'd planned. The land kept its secrets and yielded its harvests, the soil remembered everything and gave up what was needed when the season was right. The grain elevator held knowledge that would serve farmers for generations, preserved alternatives that might prove essential when circumstances made commercial varieties fail, maintained diversity that commercial agriculture wanted to erase. Marcus walked back to the farmhouse where Emma was visible through lit windows, his daughter studying at the table his grandfather had built, his family continuing work that had started long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. That was how legacy worked, not through grand gestures but through daily commitment, not through profit but through preservation, not through what you took but through what you gave. The grain elevator stood in the darkness, its sealed chamber now serving, its hidden work now recognized, its contents available to farmers who would plant them and save them and share them with others who understood their value. What had been revelation had become foundation, what had been inheritance had become mission, what had been sealed had opened to serve purposes 3 generations had worked to maintain. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in seeds and soil, in careful documentation and patient preservation, in the understanding that some work mattered not because it was profitable but because it was essential. The grain elevator his father had sealed stood as proof that truth eventually surfaced, that trust could be rewarded, that choosing right over easy mattered even when the cost seemed unbearable. Above, stars wheeled in patterns that had looked down on this land before it was farmed, before grain elevators were built, before agricultural consolidation threatened diversity that had evolved over millennia. Those stars would continue after current struggles were resolved, witnessing the slow work of preservation and the quiet courage required to maintain principles when commercial interests demanded surrender. The grain elevator breathed in the night, its structure solid, its purpose clear, its contents serving farmers who would carry forward work that mattered more than any could fully understand until circumstances made its value undeniable. The sealed door had opened, the hidden chamber revealed, and the legacy 3 generations had built continued through choices made when desperation met principle and principle proved stronger. 15 years after Marcus had opened the sealed grain elevator, Emma Holloway stood in the same chamber her father had discovered, but the space looked different now. The metal shelving that had held hundreds of undocumented seed jars now organized thousands of varieties, cataloged and available through a digital database that connected farmers across 12 states. The filing cabinets that had contained his grandfather's handwritten breeding notes now shared space with modern genetic analysis equipment, bridging traditional knowledge with contemporary science in ways that honored both. Emma was 23 now, had completed her degree in agricultural genetics, and had returned to the farm not out of obligation but because she'd found purpose in the work her family had been doing for 4 generations. Marcus watched his daughter move through the chamber with the confidence of someone who understood both the history it represented and the future it was helping to build. "The university wants to partner on a new preservation project," Emma said, pulling up data on her tablet. "They've identified 17 heritage wheat varieties that are on the edge of extinction, want to use our breeding documentation to help restore them before the genetic lines are completely lost." Marcus studied the proposal, recognizing several of the varieties from his grandfather's notes. These were strains that had been developed for specific regional conditions: drought tolerance for western Kansas, disease resistance for the humid east, cold hardiness for northern climates. Commercial agriculture had abandoned them decades ago in favor of standardized high-yield varieties, but climate change was making some of those traditional characteristics valuable again. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Marcus said. "He spent 40 years developing some of these lines, documenting how they performed under different conditions. Having universities validate that work, use it to help farmers adapt to changing climate, that's exactly what he hoped would happen eventually." The seed library had evolved far beyond what Marcus had envisioned when he'd first rejected AgriCorp's offer. What had started as a desperate attempt to honor his father's principles while avoiding foreclosure had grown into a regional resource that served hundreds of farmers, collaborated with multiple universities, and had become a model for agricultural heritage preservation that other communities were replicating. The farm itself had stabilized financially, not through any single windfall but through patient development of sustainable revenue streams. The seed library generated modest income through educational programs and consulting fees. Marcus had developed specialty crop production using heritage varieties that commanded premium prices from restaurants and artisanal food producers. Emma had started a side business propagating rare seed varieties for botanical gardens and research institutions. None of it made them wealthy, but combined with continued support from the Agricultural Diversity Network, it kept the farm operational while serving purposes that transcended profit. The foreclosure that had seemed inevitable 15 years ago now felt like a distant crisis that had been weathered through community support and stubborn commitment to doing right even when doing easy would have been more lucrative. But the work wasn't without ongoing challenges. Corporate consolidation in agriculture had accelerated, with a handful of companies now controlling the majority of commercial seed production. Patents on genetically modified crops had created legal battles about who owned the right to save and replant seeds. The principles Marcus's father and grandfather had fought to uphold, farmer autonomy, genetic diversity, seeds as common heritage, were under greater pressure than ever. Emma had become an articulate advocate for those principles, spoke at agricultural conferences and testified before legislative committees, used social media to educate people about why seed diversity mattered. She'd inherited her grandfather's dedication but expressed it differently, was willing to engage in public advocacy in ways the older generation had avoided. AgriCorp contacted me again, Emma said, not quite casually. Different representatives, same basic offer, they want to license our entire collection, willing to pay $8 million for exclusive access. Marcus felt his stomach tighten despite 15 years of similar offers. What did you tell them? That we weren't interested in exclusive licensing but would consider research partnerships that maintained open-source principles. Emma pulled up correspondence on her tablet. They're actually willing to discuss it now. Climate change has made some of our drought-tolerant varieties extremely valuable, and they're facing public pressure about corporate control of agricultural genetics. They see partnership with us as potential PR that shows they're supporting heritage preservation. Marcus read through the proposal carefully, recognizing it was more sophisticated than previous offers. AgriCorp was proposing a collaborative research agreement that would allow them to incorporate genetics from the Holloway collection into their commercial breeding programs while maintaining those base varieties in the public domain. The financial terms were substantial but not exploitative, included royalties that would flow back to support the seed library's operations. This is different from what they offered before, Marcus acknowledged. Because the landscape has changed. 10 years ago, they could dismiss heritage preservation as romantic but impractical. Now, with climate conditions shifting and commercial varieties showing vulnerability to new pests and diseases, the genetic diversity Grandpa preserved is proving essential. Emma's expression was serious. We can keep refusing all corporate involvement and maintain ideological purity. Or we can engage strategically, use their resources to advance preservation while protecting our core principles. It was the kind of nuanced thinking that came from growing up inside the complexity rather than viewing it from outside. Emma understood that absolute positions, no corporate involvement ever, or selling out completely, were both inadequate responses to the actual situation they faced. The question was whether selective collaboration could serve the seed library's mission without compromising its fundamental purpose. They spent the next week reviewing the proposal in detail, consulting with agricultural diversity advocates and legal experts, trying to understand whether this represented genuine evolution in AgriCorp's approach or sophisticated co-option of heritage preservation for public relations purposes. The conclusion was ambiguous, probably some of both, which meant careful navigation rather than simple acceptance or rejection. The agreement they eventually negotiated was complex, specified exactly which varieties could be incorporated into commercial breeding programs and which had to remain exclusively in the public domain. It created oversight mechanisms that gave the seed library veto power over how genetics were used. It established substantial funding for preservation work while maintaining the library's independence and nonprofit status. When Marcus signed the contract, 15 years after rejecting AgriCorp's initial offer, he felt the weight of choices that had seemed impossibly difficult but that accumulated experience had made navigable. His father probably would have rejected any corporate involvement, would have seen it as compromise that betrayed fundamental principles. But Emma's generation understood that achieving preservation goals required working within existing systems rather than just resisting them. Grandpa would be conflicted about this, Emma said after the signing, her voice carrying respect for complexity rather than judgment. Probably. But he also trusted future generations to make their own choices, to adapt principles to changing circumstances while maintaining core values. Marcus paused. We're not selling the collection. We're not allowing exclusive control. We're using corporate resources to advance preservation while maintaining public access. That's evolution, not betrayal. The funding from the AgriCorp partnership transformed what was possible. The seed library expanded its facilities, hired additional staff, established satellite preservation sites in different climate zones. Educational programs reached more farmers, research collaborations with universities deepened, the digital database became more sophisticated and accessible. But the most significant impact was less tangible: legitimacy. Corporate partnership, however carefully negotiated, signaled that heritage seed preservation wasn't fringe activism but serious agricultural work deserving institutional support. Universities increased their engagement, foundations that had been skeptical became interested, younger farmers who'd dismissed heritage varieties as impractical started exploring them for climate adaptation. Marcus watched all this unfold with the complicated emotions of someone who'd fought to preserve something that was now being validated by the very systems he'd been resisting. Part of him mourned the loss of oppositional clarity, the simple righteousness of refusing corporate involvement entirely. But the practical results: more varieties preserved, more farmers served, more knowledge documented and shared, justified the complexity. Emma thrived in this environment, was equally comfortable discussing genetic markers with university researchers and seed-saving techniques with traditional farmers, could negotiate with corporate representatives while maintaining relationships with agricultural diversity purists. She represented a bridge between generations and approaches, was building something that honored her great-grandfather's and grandfather's dedication while adapting it to contemporary circumstances. On a warm evening 20 years after Marcus had first opened the grain elevator, 3 generations gathered in the chamber that had become the heart of their family's legacy. Marcus, now in his mid-50s, watched Emma explain seed preservation techniques to her own daughter, his granddaughter Claire, age 6, while somewhere above them the grain elevator continued its work of storing and distributing varieties that commercial agriculture had tried to erase. "Why do we keep so many different kinds of the same plant?" Claire asked, her small hands holding a jar of heirloom wheat seeds. Emma knelt to her daughter's level, choosing words carefully. "Because each variety is like a different tool in a toolbox. This one grows well when there's not much rain. That one resists a disease that kills other wheat. This other one makes flour that tastes different. If we only kept one kind, and something happened that made it not work anymore, we'd be in trouble. So we keep all of them just in case?" "Exactly. Your great-great-grandfather understood that, started collecting these seeds almost 100 years ago. Your great-grandfather continued the work, kept everything safe even when people said it didn't matter. Your grandfather opened the chamber where it was hidden and made sure it stayed available to farmers instead of being sold to companies. And now we're keeping it going for your generation." Claire studied the seed jar with new interest. "Will I do this too when I'm grown up?" "Maybe. Or maybe you'll do something different. But you'll understand why it matters, why preserving these seeds is about more than just farming. It's about keeping options open, maintaining diversity, making sure we have alternatives when circumstances change." Marcus listened to his daughter teaching his granddaughter lessons he'd learned from his father, watched generational knowledge being transmitted not through obligation but through genuine understanding of value. The grain elevator his father had sealed 20 years ago had become a living archive, its hidden chamber transformed from secret storage to educational space where children learned why agricultural heritage mattered. Later, after Emma and Claire had left, Marcus stood alone in the chamber thinking about the journey that had started with desperate need for salvage income and had led to this moment of multi-generational commitment. He'd made choices that had seemed impossibly difficult, rejecting AgriCorp's initial offer when he desperately needed money, establishing a non-profit when profit would have been easier, accepting partnership when ideological purity would have been simpler. Each choice had been complicated by circumstances, by competing values, by the gap between what principles demanded and what practical survival required. but accumulated over 20 years, those choices had created something substantial, a working model of agricultural heritage preservation that served farmers while maintaining public access, that collaborated with institutions while preserving independence, that honored tradition while adapting to contemporary challenges. The phone on Marcus's desk rang, Samuel Ortega's name showing on the screen. Samuel was in his 80s now, had been one of the farmers who'd pooled resources to help Marcus meet the initial foreclosure deadline 2 decades ago. Their friendship had deepened over the years, built on shared commitment to seed preservation and mutual respect for the difficulty of maintaining principles in an era of corporate agriculture. "I heard about the AgriCorp partnership," Samuel said without preamble. "Some people in the network are unhappy, think you've compromised core values by engaging with corporate interests." Marcus had expected this, knew that any corporate involvement would generate criticism from purists who believed all collaboration was co-option. "We negotiated terms that protect public access and maintain our independence. The funding allows us to expand preservation work beyond what we could manage alone." "I know. And I support the decision, think it represents practical adaptation rather than betrayal." Samuel paused. "But I wanted you to hear directly that not everyone sees it that way. Some of the farmers who supported you 20 years ago feel the partnership validates the very system we've been resisting. What do you think?" "I think preservation requires pragmatism. Your father was absolutely principled, refused any corporate involvement, died maintaining that purity. But he also died with the collection sealed and inaccessible, serving nobody. You opened it, made it available, built something sustainable that continues serving farmers. If corporate partnership enables that work to expand while maintaining public access, that's strategic success rather than moral failure." After hanging up, Marcus thought about his father's choices and his own, about the different circumstances that had shaped each generation's approach to preservation. His father had sealed the grain elevator to protect it from commercial exploitation, had rejected AgriCorp's offers even when doing so cost him economically. Marcus had opened the elevator and established a non-profit that maintained public access while operating within market systems. Emma was negotiating partnerships that used corporate resources to advance preservation while maintaining core values. 3 generations, 3 different strategies, 1 continuous commitment to agricultural diversity and farmer autonomy. The approaches had evolved as circumstances changed, but the fundamental purpose, preserving genetic diversity and maintaining seeds as common heritage, remained constant. The grain elevator stood in the Kansas night, its structure solid after nearly 70 years, its hidden chamber no longer secret but still sacred, still holding knowledge that 4 generations had worked to preserve and share. The building had witnessed Marcus's grandfather collecting seeds during the Depression, had held his father's breeding documentation through decades of agricultural consolidation, had revealed its contents to Marcus when he was desperate enough to see what others had missed. Now it served a network of farmers across 12 states, collaborated with universities on climate adaptation research, partnered carefully with corporations while maintaining independence, educated children like Claire about why diversity mattered. The grain elevator his father had sealed had become exactly what his grandfather had hoped for when he started collecting seeds 90 years ago, a living archive serving working farmers, preserving alternatives, maintaining knowledge that commercial agriculture wanted to erase. Marcus climbed the ladder from the chamber to the grain elevator's main floor one last time that night, emerged into Kansas darkness that stretched away in patterns older than human agriculture. The land his family had farmed for 4 generations would continue being farmed by Emma and perhaps by Claire, would continue producing not just crops but knowledge, would continue serving purposes that transcended quarterly profits. The sealed grain elevator had tested whether Marcus would choose right over easy, whether he'd honor his father's work or take AgriCorp's money when he desperately needed it. He'd passed that test 20 years ago, had built something sustainable from that choice, had created foundation for Emma to make her own strategic decisions about how to advance preservation in changing circumstances. That was how legacy actually worked, not through rigid adherence to unchanging principles, but through continuous adaptation that maintained core values while responding to evolving challenges. His grandfather had collected seeds when diversity was abundant but threatened. His father had preserved them when commercial agriculture was consolidating. Marcus had made them accessible when heritage varieties seemed obsolete. Emma was integrating them into contemporary systems when climate change was making diversity essential again. For generations, each responding to their moment's challenges, each maintaining commitment to seeds as common heritage while adapting strategies to circumstances. The grain elevator stood as monument to that continuity, its sealed chamber open and serving, its contents available to farmers who would plant them and save them and share them with others who understood their value. Marcus locked the grain elevator for the night, its door secured with the same simple padlock he'd used for 20 years, its contents documented and accessible, its purpose clear and continuously evolving. The building his father had sealed stood now as working testament to choices made across generations, to principles maintained while strategies adapted, to trust rewarded through decisions that honored heritage while building future. The land breathed in the night air, soil that had been worked by 4 generations of Holloways, ground that had produced crops through drought and flood, through economic transformation and climate change, through quiet dedication to preserving alternatives that commercial interests wanted to eliminate. That land would continue, would support 5th and 6th generations if they chose farming, would serve purposes that extended beyond any single family's story. Emma's partnership with AgriCorp would be judged by results, whether it actually advanced preservation while maintaining public access, whether corporate involvement enhanced the seed library's mission or eventually compromised it, whether strategic collaboration proved more effective than principled resistance. Marcus didn't know those answers yet, trusted his daughter to navigate complexity he'd spent 20 years learning to understand. What he knew was that the grain elevator his father had sealed 20 years ago was serving the purpose for which 4 generations had worked. The seeds were preserved and available, the knowledge was documented and shared, the legacy was being carried forward not through obligation but through genuine commitment to values that had proven their worth across a century of agricultural transformation. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in seeds and soil, in careful preservation and strategic adaptation, in the understanding that some work mattered not because it was easy or profitable but because it was essential. The grain elevator stood as proof that sealed things eventually opened, that hidden work eventually emerged, that trust placed in future generations could be rewarded through choices they made when their own circumstances tested their character. The Kansas night held the grain elevator in darkness relieved only by security lights. The building standing as it had stood for 70 years, serving now as it had served when his grandfather had first stored grain there, transformed now from commercial facility to preservation archive to collaborative research center. The evolution continued, the work persisted, the legacy adapted while maintaining core commitment to diversity and access and the principle that seeds belong to farmers rather than corporations. Marcus walked back to the farmhouse where lights glowed in windows that had lit 4 generations of Holloways coming home after days' work. Emma's car was still in the driveway, probably reviewing partnership documents or planning expansion of the seed library's educational programs, building on foundation he'd created from the revelation his father had sealed and his grandfather had preserved. The grain elevator breathed in the darkness, its structure solid, its purpose clear, its contents serving farmers who would carry forward work that mattered more than quarterly earnings or corporate consolidation or any commercial interest could comprehend until circumstances made diversity essential and alternatives invaluable. That was the final lesson the sealed grain elevator had taught, that some work required generations to validate, that choices made in faith and principle could take decades to prove their worth, that legacy built through patient dedication eventually revealed its value when changing circumstances made preserved alternatives essential for survival and adaptation. The grain elevator stood, the land persisted, the work continued across generations who each faced their own challenges and made their own choices about how to honor preservation while responding to their moment's demands. What had been sealed was serving, what had been hidden was accessible, what had been inheritance had become mission actively maintained and strategically adapted by people who understood that some knowledge was too important to lose regardless of what commercial interests were willing to pay to control it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.